Hello, welcome to Learn It from a Layman. I'm Carl Christensen, joined tonight by Tim. I add small numbers together, Cox.
I was hoping you would say illustrious somewhere in there.
No. Notorious potentially, but illustrious, unlikely.
I'll take notorious. That's gives me a lot of street cred.
Adding small numbers related to tonight's topic, though not directly, just more of a hearkening back to our previous podcasts. But tonight we're going to be talking about economics, and this will be the basics of economics. So we're going to talk about a lot of the aspects. Economics is a huge field, a lot of things to discuss, but we're going to just obviously touch on a few of the important points. So economics, first of all, is a science that studies production, consumption, distribution of all the things of services and goods, and so that's economics involves all of the parts of a working economy. So let's talk a little bit about some of the basic things that people know about in the economy. So the economy of a particular country or of the world is measured in a lot of different ways, right? You can imagine that if you're trying to come up with a working definition for someone that doesn't have any experience with what the word economy means, you just talk about what your local grocery store, where you have things that goods that people want to come and buy. And so there needs to be an exchange of money. The store needs to provide the goods, and the consumer needs to be able to procure those goods and exchange some type of value in the process that the store will be able to use in the future. So, Tim, could you give us your understanding of what the gross domestic product is?
Well, it's not disgusting,
but it's gross.
I believe this is gross in terms of like the old German meaning of gross, right? Doesn't that, you speak a Germanic language that's not English? Doesn't gross mean like big or
big? Yeah, I mean that's in German. Yes, that's correct. So yeah, I gross in this case in the way that like you talk about your gross income, right?
There you
the
go.
whole thing, the whole picture.
Yeah.
So we're looking at.
Yeah, gross domestic product would be all the value of all the goods and services that a nation's populace produces before subtracting for, I don't know, stuff, right?
Yeah, it's literally just a measure of all of the things produced, all goods and services produced in the country. And so that's a big number to come up with. They have lots of different ways that they aggregate data and try to estimate and actually come up with hard numbers for what a country's GDP is. But there are issues with gross domestic products. So you can imagine goods and services are besides the kind of inherent difficulty of aggregating those numbers. It's also the case that gross domestic product is just measuring the production. There are other things involved in the economy beyond just the production of a good or service. For example, so GDP, if a big hurricane comes and destroys part of a state in the United States, that could be seen as a positive for GDP, because then more services and goods are going to be needed, and depending on obviously if it hits a factory and it knocks that out of service, maybe it has a deleterious effect on
that means bad.
on the GDP, but you can imagine that it could have a positive effect. So there are lots of influences that go into what happens to a country's gross domestic product. And so there have been people that have tried to come up with other ways to measure it. I've heard of, it's called the Human Development Index, combined statistic of education and life expectancy and per capita income. So there are lots of things you could take into consideration for a kind of more holistic picture of how an economy is doing versus just what rate is the gross domestic product growing. How many more goods and services are we creating versus are these getting distributed across the society well and efficiently. So there's lots of discussion to be had about that. But for the basics of economics, understanding that GDP is just a way to measure, one way to measure the health of your economy for your country, or the economics of goods and services that are being created and distributed. That's what the GDP is there for. And you hear that a lot on the news, the discussion of how the GDP is doing and what the growth is for a particular quarter. But yeah, the economics involves certainly discussion also of government systems. And so, Tim, right before the podcast, we were talking a little bit about different government systems that affect, obviously, how an economy works. We're in the United States. Could you give us kind of a very succinct definition of what capitalism is?
Yes, well, and that's anymore it's a subject of debate. But I think actually, if we set aside the polemics and look at the actual textbook definition of capitalism, I think we would probably all agree on a basic understanding of what capitalism is and some of its benefits. Capitalism is also known or commonly equated with free market economy. And it goes back to it associated with Adam Smith's invisible hand concept, the idea that the market is kind of left to do its own thing and it finds equilibrium in how much supply of this product or that service to create and what price to assign to those things. The invisible hand is kind of a metaphor, as if there is this invisible hand dictating what the cost of socks should be and how much gas should be pumped out and so forth. And in theory, the idea is that, and actually we see this in practice for a lot of things, it's not always perfect, but generally speaking, we see this working is the supply of a certain object or product or service that rises and falls to meet the demand for those objects, products, or services, and the price kind of gets to the sweet spot to match. Right. That's in theory how it's supposed to go.
So you can imagine, going back to that example of a grocery store, that's one that obviously we all have. We go down to the store. If the store were suddenly charging $100 per potato, for example, the demand would drop precipitously, right? Nobody likes potatoes.
A lot.
Right. So you can't arbitrarily name a price for a good or that is not. We could talk a little bit later about necessary goods and services like healthcare, those types of things that kind of cause some wrinkles and potentially issues and arguments about the morality of economics and the free market. But for a potato, which nobody actually needs to survive, you can't charge some arbitrary number, right? You can't say, it's $100. No one's going to pay that.
Well, as it turns out, you can arbitrarily set prices. You can also arbitrarily set supply levels in a planned economy. I guess we'll get to that in a minute, huh?
Right, exactly. You're right. So in the free market economy, if this grocery store that I'm going to says that potato is $100, I say, no, thank you. And I walk out and I go to a different store and they have a different price, more in line with what the demand is, what the supply is, and therefore I buy from that store instead. And so in a grocery store, they have to measure the demand of the goods versus the supply that they're getting, and versus what people actually pay.
Now. And the one exception to this rule is if you can successfully do what they call corner the market. That's where if you can gain control over the entire supply of potatoes, then all of a sudden you can set the price you want because you're the only potato in town. This actually did happen once, not with potatoes, but with onions of all things, where a man successfully cornered the market on onions. And I can't remember the story exactly, so I'm going to have to the Great Onion Corner. So this guy actually managed to successfully corner the market on onions, and I think he made quite a mint. It was 1955. So anyways, if you want, you can look up, onions corner the market and read the story. But yeah, basically this guy managed to corner the onion market. He made $8.5 million in 1955. But as you can imagine, it's awfully tricky to corner the market.
Sure. Right. And related. Sorry.
Sorry. That's all. So okay. Go buy an onion. And,
as long as they're not, as long as no one's cornered the market again. A related idea to cornering the market is a monopoly. And so if let's say the grocery store that I go down to doesn't have a corner on, monopoly is the idea that let's say every grocery store in town is run by the same man or the same woman, and they all set. So therefore, they have a monopoly of all that business. Every grocery store is controlled by the same company, and therefore they've cornered the market in that way, right? They can set the price to be whatever it wants, and so the idea of a monopoly, not the board game, which is also maddening in a different way. Side note, it almost made me not get married. So I don't recommend playing Monopoly.
Sounds like a fun story.
It didn't start well and didn't end well. I mean, there was nothing good about it.
You're telling me Monopoly made you low in demand.
Yeah. It was. Anyway, okay, back to economics and monopolies and cornering the markets. So the idea, once again, obviously coming back all the way to capitalism and free markets, which there probably are some nuanced differences between a free market and capitalism, but we're not going to deal with that specifically in this podcast. Yeah, exactly. But that the supply, demand, and consumer ability to pay all influence the amount of money that you can charge for something, and these things all, like Tim said, find equilibrium. So we'll talk about a couple of the other government systems that help regulate economies and what their effects are on different economic systems in just a minute. But I wanted to talk about a few of the free market principles. So, Tim, we started talking before the podcast about a few of these free market principles, and you were going to let us give us some insight into what supply and demand are and how they play off each other.
All right, supply and demand. So, if you take an economics class, you will definitely see a chart with about supply and demand. And it'll have quantity on the bottom on the x-axis, and then price on the top on the y-axis, and then it'll have two lines, a supply line and a demand line. And I won't be able to explain all the nuance of this very well, so I'm just going to go super basic because that's, I think, all I'm qualified to do. The idea is as the demand for an object rises, the price for it rises. I'll take an example that I like to use. Let's say a hurricane is about to hit Texas. All of a sudden, there is super high demand for duct tape and plywood. And so there's kind of a run on these stores, and the supply starts to go down. The demand goes up. And pretty soon, anyone who's got a roll of duct tape and some 2x4s, they can command a high price on those things because the demand is so high that the value of it rises. And so that invisible hand we talk about in a free market, because the demand is higher, the price goes up to match that demand. Again, seeking that equilibrium point where the demand matches the supply. And when you have found the price where that happens, that's the equilibrium point.
Yeah, and a real world case that people have seen recently, certainly in the United States, and I think this happened some degree globally. Everyone ran out of toilet paper here in the United States back here a year and a half ago when the pandemic hit, and I read about it. There were articles about it. I still don't necessarily understand everything because the demand for toilet paper is pretty constant. You could imagine, those things are really should be pretty proportional to the amount of people that exist in the country for obvious reasons. However, when stocking up for a unknown event, people can go a little crazy. And so all of a sudden you had a demand spike. And from what I read, there were also supply chain issues. Maybe, Tim, you were going to mention some supply chain related things, but there were those types of things caused you could buy a roll of toilet paper, a set of toilet paper online for like $50. All of a sudden the price became just exorbitant when we're talking about something that generally you'd be able to walk down to the grocery store and get it for $2.50 or $2.50 or something like that. So those things do happen where all of a sudden demand severely outpaces supply and therefore prices jump. And there are lots of different reasons, and a pandemic is just one of them.
Yeah, and so there's always that ebb and flow, but the bottom line is in a free market economy, your prices will vary. And another good way to watch this too is oil prices and gas prices. There's even a seasonal rise and fall of gas prices. You'll always see gas prices tend to go up in the summer. And part of that is because there's a greater demand for gas as people are driving long distances and doing summer stuff. So the price rises in the summer. You could, and sometimes people do get angry with suppliers, accused of gouging and that kind of thing. But we have to keep in mind that this is just part of how economics works. When demand is up, the price is going to rise, and it's actually necessary. We and Darren, I guess we'll talk about this more when we talk about command type economies. But for example, this example isn't mine. I can't remember where I heard it, but it's a good one. The duct tape and the hurricane example. Let's say there's outrage as the price for duct tape goes up in Houston as people are trying to batten the hatches for the incoming hurricane. So there's outrage. The cost of duct tape has tripled, and accusations of price gouging. How dare you, raise the price on duct tape when people need it and everyone wants it. And so the government artificially suppresses the price of duct tape and says, no, we're going to limit the cost of duct tape. Suppliers cannot charge more than such and such price for duct tape. Well, what happens is as the price stays artificially low for that product, the supply will also stay low because there's not as much, there's no signal in the market to produce more duct tape. Why would suppliers waste their time producing more duct tape when they can't, meet the when it's not going to worth their time as much? Now, go back to the price gouging situation. When duct tape is valued at and selling at 3 times its price, well, all of a sudden, not only the suppliers in the Houston area, but now suppliers farther afield say, aha, I can get more return on my duct tape if I ship it over to Houston. If that gouging price isn't there, then that signal doesn't go out, and people in Austin and Fort Worth aren't going to waste their money to spend the gas cost to ship the duct tape to Houston, because they can sell it at a better price and in their own towns. So that's an example of how the invisible hand works, and how something as counterintuitive as price gouging, or so-called, can actually help in the long run. That said, there are some faults in the free market economy.
No, you lie.
That's right. That's what they want you to think.
It's impossible.
Because we see in this very example, we see that unfortunately the richest people will have the most access to an in-demand product, while the poor will be left wanting. And so that is a real concern with the free market. So I'm a fan of free markets. And I believe that market economies are the best economy by far for everyone. But I do recognize that we sometimes run into problems, and it's a sticky situation. What do you do when the poor are being left behind in a market economy? So.
Yeah, distribution of wealth and the availability of goods and services to people across the the spectrum, as far as those that are poor, those who are rich, is a difficult problem to solve. And historically, the free market has been the most effective in raising the standard of living for all across the board, right? So the rich do get richer, and the numbers in the United States and a few other countries, but are pretty astounding as far as how much of the wealth. It's something like 75% of the wealth is controlled by 10% of the population, and so that's astounding and sounds entirely concerning, and it is to some degree. It is also the case, however, that the poor in the society, or the middle class in the society, in a free market society, have both access and ability to move their income up higher by starting their own companies, seeing a hole in supply and demand, or a need that is not being adequately filled, and therefore filling it and being able to reap the benefits. And it's also the case that rich people that have the incentive to become more rich have therefore reason to use their money to create more goods and services, therefore making that stuff available to the less economically what's the word I'm looking for, Tim? Advantaged.
Sure.
Yes, that'll be what we will go with. So even the poor and the middle class people are actually benefiting by more. If I can go to the store and buy at the grocery store, buy a whole cartload of groceries for $50 in the free market, even if I'm if I look at next door and he's got a pool, 2 slides, 5 cars, and whatever else, and I say, well, this isn't fair. That's true, and there's something to be said about that, and we'll talk a little bit about potential issues with how economies can become lopsided like that. But the point is that if the goods that I need are cheaper because this free market system exists, it does benefit society as a whole. So, like I said, there are trade-offs, and there are things that we need to talk about as far as different ways to deal with government regulation, taxes, interest rates, minimum wage, all those different things that would try to not stifle the free market, but also make sure that distribution of wealth is happening in such a way that people are not, some people are not starving, while others are glutting themselves on potatoes, if you will.
But those really nice hipster potatoes.
I've had some very good potatoes in my day. Does that mean that I'm doing quite well? I don't know.
Small potatoes.
We've lost the thread here. Okay, so free market. We've talked about free market. So the opposite of free market, and a few of the things we've already started talking about are well, not the opposite, but part of The government role in an economy is then free market regulation, right? Or how they're going to regulate the economy. So the free market
Yeah.
is a particular economic system that governments can employ to be able to handle the economy. But in most cases that I'm aware of across the world, free markets are regulated by the government in particular ways in order to deal with either supply and demand issues, scarcity issues, cost benefit issues. So let's talk a little bit about, so I guess we left some free market principles hanging there. So there's scarcity. So Tim told us about supply and demand. Scarcity is just the availability of some things, not necessarily, it's related to supply and demand for sure, but also just, there's only so much gold in the world, right? So independent of supply.
I just read recently that all of the gold that's been harvested or mined in the world in the whole history of mankind could fill only 3 Olympic pools, which is quite a bit of gold. But when you consider how much iron ore and copper we've,
Sure.
to build, thousands of cities around the world. Anyways,
right.
That's quite scarce.
Right. So scarcity is an important part of this. So if a particular resource is scarce, then it's going to be worth more. Obviously, that's going to affect supply. But that's one of the free market principles is scarcity. There is cost and benefit. So this is related to so cost and benefits related to the theory of rational choice. People behave rationally. That means they try to maximize the ratio of benefits to costs in their decisions. So this gives us, so this thing I'm looking at here gives us an example of if demand for beer is high, breweries will hire more employees to make more beer. But if the price of beer and the amount of beer they're selling justify the costs, that's the only way they'll do that, right? So people are just generally making the decision of, if I can justify the cost because of an increased benefit, that's an economic principle here. So that's related to the idea that, okay, I'm going to start a company that's going to cost me, I'm going to hire a few people, that's going to cost me money. So I know that that's there, but what's the potential benefit? Well, if I'm hiring some salespeople, some engineers, I'm going to create a product, and my benefit's going to be a significant amount of, potentially profit. So
as a side note related to cost, that's incidentally why interest rates are so important, and availability of credit. So when businesses are looking to spend on those costs to expand and to provide more goods and services and to hire more people and so forth, oftentimes they will do so with credit by borrowing money. The idea being that if I borrow money to build this factory today, then the factory will start producing and I will get a return on my investment and so forth. But when interest rates are high, or when credit is tight, when banks and lenders are less inclined to lend, and there's a credit crunch, then it's a holdup in a different kind of supply, and a supply of, well, I guess capital, but the funds, the credit funds to do these things, and it slows economic growth. So the federal government, another way they function in a regulatory role is by setting interest rates. And so you've probably heard in the news, you hear chatter about what the Fed is doing with interest rates. Are they raising them? Are they lowering them? And in times of economic contraction, like a recession, like we just went through, one of the regulatory responses of government is to lower interest rates, thereby loosening credit and making it easier for businesses to get money for whatever reason, and to keep growth from dropping too much. If an economy is growing too fast, which seems counterintuitive, but that's a thing, there are other problems. And so the federal government will, in a regulatory role, raise interest rates in order to slow things down a bit and keep it from what they call overheating. Anyways, sorry for that side
No.
tangent.
That's yeah. Well, we're trying to tie a lot of threads here together. But yeah, I had started talking about ways that the government has can influence and regulate the free market. And so I was still talking about free market principles. But like you just said, government regulation is certainly part of the discussion here, right? Economics is very much the butterfly effect in economics. When you've got the butterfly flapping its wings in Brazil causes a tornado in Oklahoma. It's the case that one change to a particular system has a lot of effects in the economy. So you can imagine something big like a pandemic, like we have and are experiencing, has massive effects globally because it's not a butterfly, it's a
It's Mothra.
yeah, it's way bigger than any particular bird species that I can think of. Tarantulas don't fly. I was thinking of pterodactyls, but that starts with a P, so it wasn't quite filed away in the same.
We've lost the thread, Carl. We've lost the thread.
Have we? Anyway, very interconnected. So regulation does affect obviously different free market principles, because all of these in an entirely free market system, these unexpected events are not. It's hard to control for them. That's when you get something like a Great Depression, right? Though some would argue the flip, right? That too much government regulation causes recessions and depressions. So there's a lot of gray areas in economics, from what I understand. I actually sat once years ago I was in Washington, D.C. with a few students from Georgetown University, and one was an economics major, and he was just explaining to me why the national debt is not relevant, doesn't matter. And I'm not an economics major, and I can't necessarily give you the exact reasoning he had, but essentially it was that the government spending, when the government controls the monetary system, is kind of the amount of money that the government owes itself or the public is kind of irrelevant. But that's just one way of thinking about it, right? The other way is thinking
and even if it's not going to hose you. It's going to hose your great grandkids. So
that's
big
right.
whoop.
I don't even know them, so that's their problem. Right. But there are different ways that it can affect the ability of the economy to grow, as far as interest payments have to be made, and does that eat more at the amount of goods and services that can be produced, or the ability the government has to regulate it if the government's having to make these interest payments to itself. It's a very convoluted system in my mind. That's probably because I'm not an economics major, but let's talk a little bit more about different ways of regulating. So like I said, we talked about the government in the United States, very free market, but with regulation, unquestionably. We see regulation in lots of different areas. Healthcare, for sure. Insurance markets are regulated. Lots of different markets are regulated but generally, the United States employs capitalism, right? Free market economy. There are other governments that do a different approach on how to organize their economies. So communism is one that I believe everyone knows. Biggest communist country is China. So Tim, tell us a little bit about communism.
Okay, communism. So again, this is a watered down and somewhat broken explanation, but whatever. The idea, and
that's what we specialize in.
That's right. Watered down and broken. Drink our lemonade.
That's going to be the name of our. We're doing a merch store, so that's going to be the name of this the first economics T-shirt that we come out with.
What if we make that the name of the biopic about our lives?
Watered down and broken. It's a very upbeat take on.
Right. All right, communism. Communism.
Sorry, yes, communism.
Marx was very angry about, how ruling classes were rich and stuff. And in his defense, he, there were lots of abuses and stuff. That's the kind of hard hitting, descriptive language you get on Learn It from a Layman. And then, anyway. So his theory in the 1800s or whenever he lived was to take it away and for the workers to rise up and take control themselves. What does that mean? Well, in practice, it has meant that a revolutionarily established government of the workers takes control of the economy and sets up what we call a command economy or a planned economy. The idea being that you don't let demand and supply determine how much of something is made. The government controls it. So the government, through whatever mechanisms it uses, determines, okay, we're going to grow this much wheat and we're going to create this much steel and we're going to produce this much, this much fabric of and so forth. And then the government, divvies it out and distributes it. The benefit of this is that the government, in theory, can make sure that everyone gets an equal share. And so this thankfully abolishes poverty and inequality in societies. And we've seen that in every communist country. I hope you're noting the sarcasm here, because this is not what ends up happening. Of course, all these systems are rife with corruption. Unfortunately, well, two things happen. Well, probably more than two things, but two things that I'm aware of. One is that with the invisible hand absent, this supply and demand, equilibrium, the governments fail to, and because it's impossible to determine and exactly how much of something should be produced. So what you'll see in these command economies, places like North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, and so forth, is you'll see rampant shortages of things where not enough was produced. And so long lines. The great news is you don't have to pay a lot for bread. It's super cheap because the government has set a price. The bad news is there's no bread to buy because I imagine that I'm guessing that part of the problem is when a free market economy working at its best, everyone has, as you mentioned, I think earlier, incentive to produce and to go out there because there is benefit to be gained. So an entrepreneur is going to go out and work extra hours to produce more of a good that's in demand because they know they can make money. That duct tape factory in Oklahoma is going to turn on extra hours to make more duct tape to ship down to Houston because there's demand. In a command economy, that doesn't happen. No one is burning the midnight oil to produce extra stuff. Why should they? There's no benefit to be derived from it. The government is setting the price, and on top of that, telling them how much to make anyway. So you have gluts of certain stuff at certain times and shortages of other things at other times. Unsurprisingly, the long-term effect of this is to stunt economic growth and prosperity. No better visual of this that I can think of than to Google a satellite image of North and South Korea. And if you look at a night image of North and South Korea and the Korean Peninsula, it's breathtaking, the contrast. You see South Korea, which is ablaze with lights as urban centers have developed, and then you see this kind of graveyard of darkness in North Korea, where there is one little pinprick of light that is Pyongyang, and then little speckles and not much else. North Korea, under a command economy, under a communist regime, has its growth has been incredibly stunted, next to South Korea, which has prospered and flourished under a market economy.
So can we safely say that you are a fan of communism?
Yes, huzzah! And here's the thing: aside from strange pariah states like North Korea, and to some degree, I guess Cuba, and I don't know, maybe a couple of small, nations out there, no one is doing communism anymore. Everyone's given up. Russia gave up in the 80s and 90s. China gave up in the 80s and 90s. They were able to successfully maintain their communist political structure, and so forth. And rhetorically, they were able to successfully transition to a market economy by declaring that 30%, 70% of what Mao Zedong said was correct, and 30% was not correct. They can still honor Mao, but anytime they need to do something that goes against the original doctrine, they say, that was the 30%. And so now they practice communism with Chinese characteristics, which AKA capitalism.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, there, in practice, most of these systems end up mixed.
Sure.
And a quick not aside, and a quick disambiguation, I guess. So we're talking about communism. A related idea is socialism, but they're not exactly the same. My understanding is socialism is the communal and or social owning and regulating of production, whereas communism is not only the government controls and regulates production, it also controls and regulates consumption. They're related ideas, of course, but there are slightly different ways that they are then borne out. As far as in a communist country, you're not even told how much you can create. It's also you're told how much you can consume. Where in socialist countries, it's just we're telling everyone how much they can. All the companies, out the economy, how much it can produce, what it can produce. However, you can consume it however you want, which with the caveat of there's only so much to consume because the government's telling you what you can consume. So. Telling what can be produced.
Can I share a definition that I just looked up on some site, which is thoughtco.com. Okay. Anyways, under communism, most property and economic resources are owned and controlled by the state rather than individual citizens. Under socialism, all citizens share equally in economic resources as allocated by a democratically elected government.
All right, so democratic socialism versus communism, for sure. Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Oh, I was going to say my favorite explanation of communism and socialism and all these market structures is have you ever seen the one where the like using the example of a cow, like communism is market economy is you have a cow and someone pays you to buy the cow, and then communism is you have a cow and the government takes the cow and shoots you, or socialism, the government takes the cow and divides it. Anyways, it's
right.
I'll have to look that up.
Yeah, I've heard that one as well. But yeah, these systems, and these aren't the only ones, but these are the ones certainly most well known: socialism, communism, and then the free market. All have advantages and disadvantages. As far as just general economy advantages, history it does. History shows us the free market is best at producing wealth. However, there's more than just wealth in life. And so I mentioned already, there are different parts of the market. So we're talking about macroeconomics, and that's the big picture. Microeconomics are like specific stores or specific markets, specific areas that are part of the whole, right? So my local mom and pop shop, if I look at how they do business and how they run that's microeconomics versus the macro picture, right? And so each each segment of the market has, the free market has different effects on us, right? We're all very happy to be able to pay whatever we want for TV streaming or internet services or whatever, something like that. But when it comes to something like healthcare and or food, some things we deem as necessary, then we see we have this desire to implement other market structures, or at least a lot of people do. And so it probably goes beyond the discussion of whether or not it should be done, the morality of such, but that is beyond the scope of this podcast. However, just to bring it into the picture as far as saying why systems become mixed, right? Why aren't we just the economy fully open to free market? There's no regulation, there's no gas tax, there's no federal bank that's regulating interest rates. Why do all of those things exist versus just open a store and do whatever you want? Or and that it comes from this desire to be able to alleviate suffering, to deal with these events, the unforeseen events, and or disproportionate distribution of resources and wealth. So all of those things kind of come together and have different weights on how people feel about how an economy is implemented and different market forces. So let's talk about a couple more items here. So Bitcoin. This is going to be then related to just generally monetary theory. And Tim, you majored in monetary theory, right?
Yes, I will provide documentation shortly.
Yeah, I think sometimes people wonder if when we say these things, we have any particular reason for saying no. Tim has no background in monetary systems.
Whatever, I use money all the time.
No, you don't. I mean, you have way less experience with money than your average Joe. Not because Tim is not good with money, but because Tim is angry at anyone that asks him for money. And that's come up in many podcasts in the past. So you can go back
including people I'm trying to buy stuff from.
Exactly. I believe that Walmart actually still owes you a cream cheese, if I'm not mistaken.
They do. Yep. Or 99 cents with interest.
Okay, back to Bitcoin. So the idea, with the American dollar, we could go way back into monetary history as far as when it was the dollar was backed by gold or silver, and what the dollar stood for versus when it just became paper money backed by the government.
Now, just to clarify what Carl's talking about here. So when paper currency was originally created, the paper was just a stand-in, a representation of real gold or silver,
Right.
Something of value, and the currency was just a representation of that value. And it's just easier to have bills around than to cart loads of gold around. And then at some point in the past, the government decided to stop associating the two and just print paper money unbacked by gold, or now no longer having an equivalent value stored away in Fort Knox or wherever.
Right.
And that's where we're at now.
Right, exactly. And now the value of the dollar is related to the scarcity of a particular good, like gold or silver or a precious metal. It's now just related to how good our government is, or whatever government your monetary system is related to the ability your government has to produce goods and services, really, and the trust that the public has in that ability. So that's what the dollar is, but the government can just print them, right? And as much as the government doesn't undermine public trust and or hyperinflate the money, meaning that there's so much money versus goods and services that all of a sudden I can pay $10,000 for a potato because I had $10,000 that I don't need. But the idea of scarcity in monetary system is certainly one that still I think evokes feelings in people. You still have this idea that I should own something that's scarce, right? I should be able to say I own this piece of something that has real value, as assigned by kind of a scarcity metric. And so that's gold. Still, people own gold for that reason, that people assign value to it because it's scarce. Bitcoin is a similar idea. I'm not going to go all into different varieties of those coins and Ethereum and Bitcoin and those types of things, but I did want to just mention the idea that Bitcoin has value, and well, I mean, there are things like Dogecoin that it's not scarce and only has value because, once again, people, for whatever reason, assign value to it. That's true in for a lot of different things. But Bitcoin, there is this idea of scarcity, right? That people have value in this because there's a certain number of Bitcoin that will ever be able to exist. And so eventually all Bitcoin that ever can exist will exist, and that will be the end of it, and therefore it will be scarce. And in as much as that is a desirable thing, people know and are familiar with Bitcoin, familiar with the value in it, and the control that is exercised by the community versus the government on its value. It is therefore become very valuable as of late, right? The last 2 years, it jumped thousands of percent in value. So the governments are trying to figure out what to do with these types of systems as far as regulating and figuring out how they're going to play with the economy. But the idea that the scarcity can still hold sway in monetary systems is certainly borne out in Bitcoin, among other things. Tim, anything to comment on that?
Buy at your peril.
I've made a lot of money in Bitcoin, Tim. So
I'm sure you have.
Let me give you a quick aside for the audience. I'm not rich, all right. So I'm happy with my economic status, but when I say a lot of money, I mean a small amount of money. So I have invested slightly in Bitcoin, but yeah, just for the basics of economic podcast, irrelevant of what the podcast host is saying, the idea of Bitcoin is useful only in as much as people value it. Thus the own risk.
And we see these kind of bubbles in throughout history of market economy. A few come to mind. The tulip bulb craze of the Netherlands, which I think happened in when did it happen, Carl? 1600s, 1700s?
No idea.
So it was in the in that time period, but these certain tulip bulbs would get a certain virus that would cause them to have these kind of variants, stripes and different things. And so there were never many of them, but they became very popular and very valuable. And it got to a point where you could trade, some bulbs for a house and things like that. They became very high priced until eventually it popped, everything plummeted in value. And so anyways, when you have things like Bitcoin, and I don't know enough to give a nuanced analysis, but it's something that is separate from any quantifiable, anything of value. It's as Carl, you mentioned, it's valuable because people think it's valuable, because we decide it's valuable. That's a prime recipe for a bubble and a crash, and we've seen it, bubble up and burst and bubble up and burst. So who knows how many times it'll happen, and who knows whether Bitcoin will find a way to make itself useful as a currency. I question whether it ever will, because its value is so darn volatile. it just I think one of the functions of a currency is that it's of fixed value. So I can buy something for $5, and a year from now I can use those $5 to buy something of equal value. But if now my $5 is only worth $1 or whatever, you know so I wonder. I have big question marks about cryptocurrency in general, though they may find some place. Who knows?
Yeah,
I'm hedging all my bets so I can be right no matter what.
the adoption of Bitcoin and Ethereum specifically in apps like Venmo, things like that to me establishes kind of a staying power that I think will mean something. But yeah, the idea that cryptocurrencies are certainly speculative. They're still very, very recent. Within the last, Bitcoin, I believe, is 2009 came about, and so we're talking about the last 12 years that these things have existed, and just there are different ways that they get mined and created. Like I said, different numerical ways to earn them and mine them, and how they're distributed, and these ledgers that keep track of them, and all those things are all very new, and how those things are going to affect the economy, and what people are actually going to value here in another 10 years, it's unknown. But in as much as applications like Venmo, which has mass adoption across at least the United States, I'd imagine across the world, in as much as those are now used as ways to pay on those platforms, I think that probably is signaling some degree of acceptance. But anyway, we've kind of gone down the rabbit hole a bit further than the basics of economics would probably let us.
Bitcoin hole.
Okay, that's it, right?
We've lost the thread.
Okay, two other things I wanted to touch on before we wrap up here. So, like I said, there are a lot of things we could continue talking about, but I did want to talk about depression and recession. So when we talk about the economy, when things are going great, you just don't really worry about it too much. There's money in the bank account. Either your company's doing well, or your employer keeps paying you and giving you raises. But then something happens, right? And things change, depression or recession. So we've seen recessions in our lifetime. Everyone listening to this has seen a recession because, we had a recession here at the beginning of the pandemic, where things went poorly briefly. So the difference between a recession and a depression, I had to look this up because I wasn't entirely clear. A recession is just a short-lived depression, essentially. Recession is 2 quarters or more of a year that where economics, the GDP has contracted or stagnated. So we're no longer growing the economy. Essentially, the goods and services available are either less, or it's less than they were before. And so people lose their jobs. Money is not as readily available. People don't lend it as much, and then the government tries to come up with reasons for you to spend money, and so they try to create an incentive. That idea of the free market principle. The government wants to incentivize then the goods and services being produced. Recession, but then there's a depression, right? A depression is a long, protracted dip in the GDP or the economy as a whole. And so the last one that we experienced here in the United States was the Great Depression. That's the only, actually, when I was reading, it was the only one that was actually a full protracted depression, was the Great Depression, and that was in the 1930s.
Right, so there were no depressions in the 1800s?
That's what I read, if I understood it correctly. There have been many recessions, but a multiple year-long stagnation and or contraction of the U.S. economy was only 1930s. But do fact check me on that, because I only read one article about it. But yeah, so there are different ways to to kind of try to see if a recession is coming, to kind of predict it. I guess there's something called a yield curve that helps predict. So if your economy is headed toward a recession, generally a yield curve is supposed to be a positive. As interest rates come, I won't be able to describe it particularly well. Like I said, I am certainly a layman in this topic, but essentially the yield curve flips when you go towards a recession. And so when you see a negative yield curve, then you know a recession is around the corner. And but recessions, obviously, they cause lots of issues, and they are felt across, from the rich all the way down to the poor. And they affect supply chains. They affect distribution and consumption, and so they cause a lot of issues for everyone. Except the government has lots of different ways to try to get us out of recessions, and sometimes those and that if you have seen the movie, well, it is also a movie, but the play Alexander Hamilton. Have you seen Hamilton, Tim?
I've seen the first part of it. My wife and I actually started watching it last week. I've read the book
Right.
that the play was based on.
Yeah. Well, what is the name of that book again?
Hamilton?
I don't know. Is it just Hamilton? I thought that. Okay.
I can't remember, but it's at Hamilton and it's something,
Good. We're spreading lots of useful information. Hamilton documents the life of Alexander Hamilton, who was a founding father of the United States and was a big proponent of the Federal Reserve, the centralized bank of the United States, which gives the federal government control over currency. And so he established that with George Washington's blessing, and so that gave the federal government a lot of control over obviously currency. And so so nowadays the Fed is still around, and it has meetings, and it determines, what is the interest rate going to be. It does a number of other things, but that's one of the ways that they can affect the desire of people to create goods and services is lower interest rates, meaning more incentive to use your money as opposed to bank your money, because lower interest rates meaning I'm not earning money on my money in the bank, and therefore because of inflation I'm actually losing money. So lower interest means I have an incentive to go ahead and spend that money to create more goods and services to be able to bring in money that way. So it's one of the ways that they use, one of the tools that they use in trying to get the economy out of a recession. How they use it, when they use it, all of those things are open for debate, and lots of people have different ideas. But it's inflation is something that they have to watch for. So if inflation starts going out of hand, then they have to raise interest rates because they don't want people spending money as much. That's at least my layman understanding of it. Tim?
Yeah, sounds good to me. Yeah. No,
Okay.
I think it'd be good to bring up Volcker and in inflation killing in the when was that, 70s and 80s?
You're making things up.
No, the
Vulcans. I know what Vulcans are.
Volcker.
Vulcans are in Star Trek.
Volcker. Yeah, Vulcans live long and prosper. No, but if you were alive in the 70s or 80s, you I wasn't. Well, I was alive in the 80s, but I wasn't economically aware. But inflation was high, and Volcker, that was an example of the Fed, cranked interest rates way up. I love the story of my parents in the mid 80s buying a house, and they were excited to get a 9% interest rate on their home loan, which is pretty nuts by today's standards. But yeah, the interest was and it actually spurred some recessions. There were, I think, 2 or 3 recessions in the 70s and 80s as the Fed cranked the interest rate way up to combat inflation. I believe it's generally considered a success by most economics. It was ugly, but it brought inflation under control. But yeah,
Okay.
you couldn't get a loan for love or money unless you're going to pay through the nose for it.
I always pay through the nose. Actually, that's you, Tim. You are always angry when you're paying money, so it must be
Never
expected.
again.
Okay, well, let's wrap up the podcast, I guess. So, like I said, I always do a quick update, and aside from our topic on our listeners. I will thank the North Dakotan that has listened to us. So we have many listeners. Yeah, we got him. For her. So across all 50 states. Now we must have offended the Nunavutians. None of it. The Canadian province and the Northern Territories in Australia both have listened to us in the past, but not recently. So we need to recruit them to come back and join in our layman topic.
We'll do a special tailored topic for them: cold places.
I don't think Northern Australia is a cold place.
Oh, Northern Australia. Oh, yeah. Okay.
How about
places I've never been to?
Right. We do have a great listener base in India, the UK, Australia, Canada, and obviously the United States. So go ahead and continue sharing our content. If you have something that you want to know or something that you would like Tim to stop talking about, let us know.
That's right. And if you buy our merch, I will stop talking about it.
I do need to get that merch store up.
That's right. But, fact check. The Long Depression was a worldwide price and economic recession beginning in 1873 and running through March of 1879 or 1896, depending on the metrics used. So it was a depression back in the late 1800s. So there you go.
All right. Well, I wasn't there, so it didn't happen.
That's right.
Okay,
wait,
good.
I wasn't in none of it. Therefore,
no.
Yeah. Okay. We lost the thread.
Yeah, we did. That's the theme of the podcast. All right. Well, as far as economics go, if you have any questions or any things that we needed to clarify, let us know in an email or on Twitter or on Facebook. And we'll be back again soon with we'll be doing the basics of algebra in the not too distant future. So watch for that one. And if you're still looking for our 1940s history podcast, blame Tim.
I wasn't there, so.
Yes. All right. Well, thanks, and we will talk and see you back again for our next podcast.